And we are live. Hey there, everyone. Thanks so much for joining another Seattle Data Guy live. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining us as well. Eric, how's your day going?
It's going well. It's going well. How about you?
That's going great. Going great. Can't complain. The weather's going to be warm here for, I think, at least another week or two, which is, I don't know. I keep hoping it's going to cool off, but it'll be nice. Like, I enjoy the warmth as well.
Yeah. Now is the time where I start to recuse myself from those conversations because being in Miami, working with people from Boston mainly, they'll start to have sweaters on and be indoors, and they're like, "It's still gray outside," and I look outside and it's like 90 degrees. So I have to.
That's funny.
October to April is when I stop talking about weather.
That makes sense. I mean, I think you do have to deal with the occasional hurricane, I imagine, but other than that, I'm sure it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, those are pretty much just rainstorms for us at this point. Like pretty good infrastructure that you could say that there's a category 3, 4, 5 coming in, and most people aren't evacuating at this point.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. So you've been working, I think, in data for about a decade. I don't know if you think about it that way, but I think that's about right. You've kind of been all over in terms of like working as a consultant and now kind of leading a data organization in a financial institution. So I mean, just to give some background, how did you kind of get there?
Yeah, I say this a lot. My path, if you map every point to the previous point, makes sense. But if you look at where I started to where I'm at now over the last decade or so, it doesn't make really any sense. And so I was undergrad neuroscience, thought I wanted to be a doctor, finished all my pre-med requirements, realized junior year I didn't want to do that. And so picked up a double major in econ, finished that, and I was like, well, now what? What do I want to do? So and speaking with people, realized that healthcare was the best way to go about executing on those majors. And then in addition to that, thought that data might be the best way to make use of that tandem. So I got my first position was as a BI analyst for a revenue cycle management company based in Chicago. Little fish, big pond. Realized that I had very narrow scope in terms of my work and wanted to expand upon that. So that's when I went into consulting, specifically healthcare consulting, grew there from individual contributor to people leader, started managing teams, started helping business development, recruitment. And there, because of a boutique company, had the opportunity to wear a lot of different hats and work across many different clients. But again, my scope was limited to healthcare, but I did get a good understanding of data, great understanding of business. And so picked up a master's started a master's in computational data analytics with Georgia Tech. And so during that process, got recruited to a different firm that was more industry agnostic, but still data focused. And so between those two, really rounded out my technical acumen, technical skill set. And the purpose of picking up the master's wasn't necessarily to be hands on keyboard, but it was just to have a better understanding of technical design, how to manage and build out teams and know how to find the right resources or talent for whatever technical solution we're trying to build. And towards the end of my master's, I got recruited to the bank that I'm currently at full time. And so, from wanting to be a doctor to being a data executive, and that doesn't really make sense, but each step in between has aligned with the previous step and allowed me to grow and expand in the career. But ultimately, I think it comes down to always being curious, always being open-minded to learning more and adjusting to where my passions lie and going from there.
Yeah. I think there's a lot. I kind of went the not the doctor side, but definitely the healthcare. Like I wanted to work a lot, I think, in healthcare and data when I first started because I thought it's an interesting space and it seems like one that there's always need for basically solving new problems. So no, I think it's a great space to start because there's there's a lot of value you can add. Um, Speaking of that, like one of the things I wanted to talk about as someone who kind of sits probably having to decide what projects get taken on a lot of the time, I really wanted to dive into that and just figure out, okay, how do you figure out what projects the business actually cares about? So just starting maybe broadly, like how do you have a process to kind of start that discussion with the business or how do you go about it?
I mean, honestly, the tried and true process is, where does the money lie? Like, where are you going to either impact an increase in revenue or decrease overall expense in an area. And so I think the closer that you can get the data solution to that, the more inclined the business is going to be to use it, the more inclined they're going to be to invest in it. And I think that's where a lot of data leaders, data teams miss the mark, is they'll think, let's build the coolest thing or the most advanced thing. And that might be awesome. It might be fun. It might be interesting. But if you don't get usage right away, or the business finds more value in an Excel report that they can easily tinker with and get the results that they need, you're essentially building digital paperweights that are going to sit on a shelf. And so I think conversely, on the business side, the part where I see the business sometimes miss the mark in building out data solutions is trying to do the same thing that they've always done without trying to think about it in a slightly more advanced way. Classic example is we want to export this data to Excel. And then within Excel, there's a bunch of pivot tables that are applied, or we compile all of them into one report and do a bunch of VLOOKUPs. And so I think the translation between that from the data team to the business is, let's understand your process. Let's try to figure out what you do with the data once you have it. And let's reverse engineer whatever that final result is to whatever data solution we're building, and try to eliminate all those manual steps, try to enable alerting, whether it's off of thresholds being passed or when an event occurs. And from there, I think you can start to reduce the amount of rote, monotonous tasks that either a data person or a business person is doing. You can start to enable or build out more scalable systems based off of whatever operational processes the business is undertaking. And then also it creates a partnership between the technical solutions and the data solutions that you're building and the business people, so that then you can start to think about it. All right, we have our core platform or our core system and our core operations taken care of. What are now some of those more advanced and edge cases that we can start to look to implement? So my process is typically that: find where the money lies, figure out or identify the different impactful business processes that are being driven by data today, and reduce the amount of manual tasks within them. And then once you start to get some wins off of that, try to see if you could advance some initiatives along the data continuum.
Yeah. One point you brought up there was that, you know, we as data people like to lean in and do the cool things, and, you know, AI is the thing right now. Everyone wants to add that in, but I think sometimes that comes from the business, right? Like I've had conversations where really it's like the business is like, it'd be great if we could add AI somewhere here, right? Because probably they want to go to their board and be like, hey, we're doing AI now. How do you kind of have those conversations with the business when they're coming in and being like, we want to do something and it has no strategic, you know, value per se, or at least it's not connected. It's just purely so they can almost like have a narrative.
I think it's level setting. And it's like, since I started, I've heard about, we need data scientists. We need to build this AI prediction algorithm or regression model. We need blockchain, or we need to have our own coin, or we need to build an NFT. And now we need generative AI solutions. And at each step and each phase in the process, it's chasing the hype cycle, hearing what your competitors are quote unquote doing, and trying to chase after that. But if you get to the pragmatic point of view from building out a data infrastructure, it's holding the mirror up and saying, okay, you want to build this Gen AI solution, or you want to build this AI tool. What are you going to do with it? Explain to me your process, or explain to me your rationale. And usually when you do that, it ultimately manifests in, well, I think it'd be cool for us to be able to present that to whomever at the board, or be able to present that to the executive team, or be able to announce that to the public. But when you get beyond that surface level conversation, you also ask, okay, let's say we do build this. Do we have data to support this regularly? Do we have a team to support this and iterate based off of that initial POC that we develop? And if the answer to that is no, we don't have the data because we have a SharePoint repository with a bunch of Excel files that are updated manually every day, or we don't have a team to build this and we thought we would just be able to hire consultants for 3 months, and then once they leave, no one's going to pick up the baton and it's going to ultimately just disappear because something breaks and nobody knows how to fix it. If those fundamental and pragmatic pieces from building data infrastructure for the future is not there, then again, you just get stuck in this development cycle that aligns to a hype cycle. And yeah, it might be something cool that you can present to the board or you can present to the public, but then when you actually go to push it into production and you try to make use of it, the operations aren't there to support it, the people aren't there to support it. And then I think that's ultimately what one of the things that causes a rift between the data and the business, and is why a lot of data leadership positions are not well defined or have a tenure of a year to 2 years, is because you need to give some pushback and think about things from more of a long-term view. So when there is any hype cycle, you have the foundation to build upon it, and you're not just building a straw man tool that has no like bones or has no basis.
Yeah, I like that you brought up the SharePoint example, because I feel like that's a great way of like kind of almost telling a company kind of where you're at. It's like, look, you want to be doing something that assumes you're, at least have data stored somewhere that is easy to access by your AI. And I'm sure someone, and well, I'm sure Microsoft already has a tool that like Copilot that can just sit on top of your SharePoint and do some level of analysis on it. But there is something to be said about like maturity and being ready for it, which reminds me of like, I mean, now that we're kind of on AI, reminds me of something that Joe Reese recently kind of was talking about or wrote about how, AI and BI, like obviously there's some relations, but they're also different. Is that how you kind of view it? Like you can kind of do AI before doing BI, but like because they're different skill sets, or how do you kind of view that side?
It's tough because I don't think you need to have a full blown, like a lot of people throw the term 360 view of your business or 360 view of your customer, 360 view of your client. I don't think you necessarily need to have that in order to deploy AI, but I do think you have to have a base level of understanding. Like if I, in the same example you gave with like, us talking about SharePoint, if I went to you as a business owner or as an executive and I said, what are your top 5 costs in your business, or what are the top 5 things earning you revenue, and stratify that across region or stratify that across location, and it took you a week, 2 weeks to compile that data and with 100% certainty tell me that those are the correct data, and or that data is based off of a 2-3 month lag, we have bigger problems to figure out and identify than trying to build some AI tool on top of those data. Because I think I commented or discussed this on one of your posts recently, like a lot of people will ask for real-time data. And the assumption with AI is that it's something that you can use in real time, usually. So if you can't bring real-time operations or real-time data together at the same time, then building those things is, in my opinion, useless and just very expensive in terms of trying to build or architect that out. So I don't necessarily think you need to have all of BI to then start AI, but I do think that BI or having a descriptive understanding of the problems that you're trying to solve for or your business is the precursor to doing something that is prescriptive or predictive. Because if you don't know how to describe your business or you don't understand how to answer a business problem, how are you going to make predictions about that, regardless of whether they're deterministic in old AI or probabilistic in new AI? It's just, we can always say garbage in, garbage out and talk about data inputs, outputs there. But I think it's not only from the technical side, but it's also from the operational inputs and the operational outputs from whatever it is you're trying to build or solution out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and digging into like the operations side of things, like how do you, like, for people who aren't accustomed to that, maybe are more used to like, oh, I just build a dashboard and that's the end of my project. How do you kind of take it to the next level and start both thinking about the operational side of your business and how it impacts it, but also how have you seen it done successfully where it's like, okay, we've actually implemented this into the operation side?
I think that gets back to the first conversation we were having, which is like brokering and building those relationships with the business and having them be partners with you in terms of developing the solutions, and not just building something in a silo or building something that you perceive as valuable to the business, or building something that the business comes to you and say, this is what we want. Like, it is an ongoing conversation. You should wireframe it out, both from a solution point of view as well as how it is going to be used. And you should try to remove the governor on the business side of, this is how we've always done it, and try to pull it back or rein it in a little bit in terms of, we need to build the coolest thing or the most complete thing immediately. Like, I've seen people discuss like minimum viable product versus minimum usable product, and I do lean more towards minimum usable product since learning about how people define that. But I do think it is trying to figure out, from a business impact and effort standpoint, what are some of the operational workflows or paths that we can map out, and then tie the data solution into each of those different operational workflows. And then from there, continue to iterate and build upon that. So a way that I've seen that done in practice is one of the first consulting engagements that I was on. We had a big problem around like chronic conditions that were left untreated. And so it was working for a government payer, and essentially the total cost of care for those treatments was extremely high, and the quality of life for patients wasn't exactly where it needed to be, especially from like an intervention standpoint that we could provide for those different treatment groups. And so what we did with the data is, we first took a look at the full patient population to understand what were the top cost drivers from each of those different treatment groups or each of those different categories of diseases. And then from there, tried to drill in to see, was it like one or two patients or one or two members, or was it 1,000 members that were being affected by things like diabetes or hypertension or septicemia. And then from there, we were able to drill in at a cohort level and understand for each of the different patients within that, what their risk profile was, whether it was something that could be attributed to a lack of RX adherence or pharmacy adherence, or the fact that they were going to inpatient or emergency room visits instead of going to primary care visits, and why that was. And so it's like, from getting that top understanding of where the lower quality of life and costs were, down to drilling into each like cohort level as to what strategy might be able to nudge them into either healthier decisions or adhering to their medical plan more effectively. We were able to provide more of a case management optimization around each of those cohorts and each of those members. And that ultimately, over time, helped us manage the population more effectively. And so that, to me, is a way that you can take a look using just high-level descriptive statistics down to each individual category or each individual strategy that you have, and then execute that from an operational standpoint. If you don't have the data there, then it's just ultimately up to hearsay of, well, we think that this is a problem in our community or our environment. Let's find everybody who has that problem, and then let's target them. It's not specialized, not specific, and is more of just like a shotgun approach to trying to treat a problem, rather than trying to gain clarity and trying to drill in to specifically target and specifically treat people based off the strategy needed for those individuals.
Yeah. Have you sorry, have you seen any case, because like that's kind of like the, like, let's go with the gut versus let's go with kind of data approach. Have you seen
Yeah.
any cases where perhaps someone's gut was going one way, but then the data showed something else, and you kind of had to work through that, probably dissonance?
I mean, exactly that example I was telling you about. The chief medical officer thought that like the patients who like during maternity or like even asthma were having a lot of issues in terms of like early childhood or throughout their pregnancy, that there was just like this huge problem. And so when we went into the data for, I believe it was those two, we found that it was really like 2 or 3 patients that just had really adverse
Mm,
and really like acute instances of very specialized care, and it overall was just like very costly in terms of what they went through. But it was more of like this random chance occurrence than it was uh, like a widespread impact across the full patient population. So in any instance like that, it's let's take a look at the data, let's understand and gain clarity around what the data are telling us, and then if there's anybody who's like a naysayer in the business or like no, like that can't be, I do think this is a problem, it's just presenting them the facts and saying like, look, of the 500,000 in spend and the overall population, 3 people were responsible for 80% of that. And here's why. It had nothing
yeah.
to do with treatment and everything to do with like, oh, somebody got hit by a car. We can't
Mm,
control for that. Versus, okay, out of the 500,000 spend, like 2,000 people make that up, and we can attribute that to all of these people aren't taking this specific medication. Aren't all these people aren't taking insulin,
yeah.
and they've not been to the primary care provider, and they keep going to the hospital. Like, all right, let's figure out how to route those members to a primary care physician so that they can get treated and so that they can get a prescription for insulin, and then continue to follow up with them and engage them over time to ensure that they aren't ending up in the hospital with very like terrible circumstances around diabetes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that brings me back to the one of the first companies I worked at where we were doing like healthcare and like fraud detection. Um, and yeah, you kind of run into these issues where even if you maybe know why something is happening, there's like limitations on what you can do, right? Like it might not be cost effective, or you have to think differently in terms of like the solutions you can provide on the actual business side, right? Like maybe one of the things that we found out was like, okay, there's some people who may abuse, and these being providers, not healthcare or like patients, like they might overuse certain types of x-rays because there is no limit in the insurance plan for it, so and they're just going to use it, but because it's so cheap per claim, um or it's not that expensive, it's really hard to adjudicate, right? Because you have to like go through and like adjudicate each claim almost one by one. I assume I'm not as familiar on the actual adjudication process, but because you can't go through and do that one by one, you're like, well, we can't really fix this problem, right? Like even if it is a problem, we like going back to the operational side, it's like we're limited on how we can actually fix it. So I think that's like one of those sides where it's like maybe there's value, or maybe there's a big number tied to this problem, but sometimes there's not much you can do, at least not in what people might be assuming you could fix it operationally.
Yeah, I think the other part too, you said adjudication, so that rings a bell with like the work that we were doing. So another project that we had was taking a look at providers. So what I was just talking about was more member centric, and we took a
Yeah.
look at providers and took more of the like, all right, we addressed some of these different like population health issues. Now let's take a look at overall provider performance. And we were looking at providers and then starting to identify situations where maybe they were not prescribing the right medication or over emphasizing the need for certain scans, like you're alluding to. Like we would meet with some provider groups and they were angry that we hadn't adjudicated claims or that we hadn't paid out claims. And so before we could even get to looking at the data or trying to help them from a business standpoint, they wanted to talk about something that wasn't even in our control. And so it's also understanding people and understanding the business and understanding that what you find most important or most valuable might not be agenda item number 1, might not be agenda item number 10 that they want to talk about. And so it's also thinking about operationally, like what other areas you need to fix or enable first before you can even get into even descriptive analytics or data that can help them.
Yeah. Do you often find you need to kind of get those trade-offs? Because I feel like I've had conversations with other data leaders where sometimes it's both trade-offs for multiple things, right? Like, oh, I want to take on this project, this year, so I need to figure out a way to save 50 grand somewhere to get the money to take on this project, or at least to prove that, or to prove another project is making 50 grand to take on this project. Or in other cases, like you said, like we need to deal with another problem that maybe the operations team cares about. We don't think is necessarily as valuable per se, but does provide some, and it'll help them kind of buy into this next project. Do you feel like you often have to kind of get those trade-offs, and how so?
Depends on the business, depends on the executive team. Ultimately, like I said, you have to find where the money lies and try to figure out where you can make improvements, either around gaining revenue or decreasing expenses. But if it's a company and an executive team that feels like they have a somewhat grasp on operations and they want to start to lean in to utilizing data more effectively, then that's, I think, less hard of a sell, versus if it's a company that feels like their intuition based operations has been like helping the company grow, and the proof is that they went from 10 million to 100 million in sales over the last 10 years. Like, that's a little bit tougher of a sell if you don't have people, because the other part with that is like, when you start to introduce data, I always say data provide clarity, not answers. So it's going to provide clarity, not just around what you're doing well, but what you're doing wrong. And so for people who feel that they have driven this business to where it is today off of intuition, when you start poking around and saying like, this assumption was wrong, this strategy that you implemented was wrong, this other thing was wrong, then they start to latch on to the first thing they can find wrong with the data process. Oh, well, you gave us this prediction and it was way off that 1 month for that one company in that one state that we operate in. And you're like, but what about the other 999 companies and states that we operate in? So as you start to uncover those things, like I think it's important to, for any phase, start to find some of the quick wins or some of the areas where you can start to provide value and show the value of data, while at the same time, I think data and data solutions have an attribution problem in terms of, if I gave you a product recommender system that you could give to a marketing department to send out targeted emails or a targeted marketing campaign, or I gave it to relationship managers to be able to talk to their different clients in order to help cross-sell them on certain products that we have. If those are new things from data, but then the marketing team or the relationship manager is the one who executes the operations, if you don't talk about that from a data perspective, and you have a marketing leader or you have a chief revenue officer that wants to take that credit, it's very easy then later on, if people weren't paying attention to what data was doing, to say, why do we need data? They haven't really done anything for us lately. So yes, get the quick wins. Yes, help out the teams, but just make sure that you are being thought of or have a seat in the table when think like these strategies or these programs are being discussed, so that it's not to say, oh, we earned this company $2 million last year, but it is to say that data had a hand in the million that was made here and the million that was made here. So then when they ask, what is data doing for us? Well, they partnered with marketing and they partnered with the chief revenue officer. And because of those partnerships, we're able to go from $10 million to $12 million in revenue year over year.
Have you had any experiences where maybe like another executive kind of brushed over the work you did and took most of the credit? Or is it just like you just realized that very quickly and you're like, all right, got to make sure I'm always attached to projects?
Trying to think of specific examples. Like there's definitely been times where it's maybe not stealing or taking all of the credit, but it's more of just like ignoring the role that data had in it. So it's, I think I've gotten out from under that most of the time at this point in my career, but I would say definitely early in my career, not showcasing or not highlighting the value of data or not being a strong advocate for the work that the team was doing was an easy way to be like just pigeonholed in terms of the work that we were doing, or just not really given the recognition for the great work that was done.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like that you brought up like the seat at the table kind of comment, because I remember someone, I don't remember what I was listening to. It might have been like Gordon Wong on, I think, Joe Reese's podcast, but it might have been someone else. And they were talking about how it's like if data is not brought in until like after the decisions are made, strategic decisions, or like we're going to go do something, we're going to go down a certain path, and then you're asked afterwards to like kind of calculate the impact of it, or to somehow be involved, then you don't really have a seat at the table. You're really just that kind of service, that service cost center, so to speak, and then you're only there just to provide information and not to provide any sort of insight. So, no, I think I really like that idea of like trying to make sure you have a seat at the table, but it is also earned. It's not like you can demand it if it's not some level of like we've earned that seat at the table.
Yeah, of course. But to that end, like, people talk about from a security standpoint, always having security in at the beginning of any sort of product design or product build, because if you wait until the end, then cyber or governance is going to say like, well, this doesn't meet this SLA, or this violates this part of GDPR, or whatever the case may be. And then you have to like redo the whole project.
Yeah.
And so if you're bringing in data at the end, similarly, if you bring in data and now all of a sudden they're showing you why all of these different strategies or hypotheses or operational workflows are wrong, or where they could improve, then it's a lot of rework. It's a lot of operational debt that's been built up over time, or tech that's been built up over time. And if you don't have strong partners in the room, or if you are seen as like this new person who just got to the table, then a lot of people are going to be angry that you're even proposing that you restart the development process, or change what their quote unquote baby was for the last 6 months in the 11th hour. And so in those instances, like, you might create a lot of enemies rather than having people who you can work across the aisle with within the executive team. So I think that's another important aspect of having data at the table, or security at the table, really anybody who's pertinent to the development lifecycle at the table. Because if you start to add people at the end, then you're going to probably create some sort of abrasion between the people who've been there and the new people who are at the table. And it just makes implementation that much more difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like that for most of this conversation, we've kind of like, it's interesting that we're talking more about how people feel versus how the data is coming out, because I think that's sometimes an aspect, if you work more closely as an IC, you maybe view things as a little more black and white, where it's like, is the project done? Is it not? Is the dashboard, is the data right? Is it not? Whereas there's so much that goes into, I think, the projects we take on that are really about, getting people on the same page and excited to do some work, getting people to buy in. How do you feel like you've successfully got people to buy into projects, whether it's, they were excited at the first part, or they were maybe needing to get kind of wooed over to the other side?
Well, I always say this, that organizational change management is the most challenging part of any data project, of any data implementation. I also think that data quality is not a technical issue, but a people issue or an operational issue. And so changing people's behavior and getting them to adapt or change how they work or the way that they do things is a really tough thing. And I think that, again, it comes down to building relationships and brokering relationships, and just communicating with the business or the different partners that you're working with. In terms of where I have found success, it is trying to speak with people before I start development, or before I'm working with the team to prioritize work, to understand what their pain points are, what their pain points were with the last data team that they worked with, or with the current data people that they've worked with. Understand where their needs weren't met. So, a lot of times you're not going to walk into an organization most of the time and they're going to say, I've never worked with data before. I've never worked with a data person before. I've never worked with a consulting company or an internal resource that's in data before. It's usually going to be, I've worked with X, Y, and Z person. Here are all the reasons why it didn't work out with them, or what they did and how they burned me, or whatever the case may be there. And so in all of those situations, I do think it's understanding what failed the last time, why it failed, and starting to get them involved as early on as possible within the process so that they feel like they have had an instrumental role in building out whatever solution, and checking with them consistently to say, okay, we've built you this dashboard. Here's how I would envision you using it. Is there anything else that you feel is missing? How would you use it? Does this meet the specifications that we talked about during the wireframing session? Okay, it does, it doesn't, taking back whatever their critiques are or their adjustments that they want to make. And so that's a very different conversation than I built something off to the side for 3 months and now I bring it to you and you're like, that doesn't meet any of my requirements. Oh, great. Here's another person telling me what I need to do rather than figuring out how to best help me. And so that's the biggest, like, I have conversations with people all the time where I'm like, what is the relationship that you have with your data leader? Or if I'm talking to a data leader, it's what is the relationship you have with the business or this executive? And it's like, oh, well, we meet in a group meeting with other executives. Okay. Do you guys meet on one-on-ones? Do you know anything about them? No, not really. I think we met in a one-on-one 2 years ago. And it's like, if you don't have that sort of connectivity and that bridge between what the business is doing to what the data solutions are that you're trying to build, 99 times out of 100, that's going to fail. You might get lucky one time, but most of the time that relationship's going to fail. And ultimately the connectivity between the data solutions you're building to the business is going to fail.
Yeah. Yeah, you could say it's not much of a relationship if you've only met once 2 years ago. It's just a passing of two ships. But kind of flipping the perspective from, like, more high level and talking to other executives to setting up teams. How do you kind of envision teams being set up? Do you kind of see it as, you have a eclectic mix of people where some people are maybe more technical and some people are, maybe more soft skill focused? Or do you view that everyone could everyone should be a little more balanced?
I think it depends on the maturity level of the organization. And it also depends on like what types of roles you have in the organization. If you're a startup and you're you're a small business, it's really hard to say, I need a really good specialist who's going to be the best data engineer, the best data architect, who is like in their lane and doesn't care about anything else. Like, that's really hard for a small business because you don't have those other functional roles or functional departments to support that individual. So you're more likely going to be needing a generalist who does maybe specialize in a certain domain. And once you have a data leader established, my personal take is you should get a mostly data engineer who has some ability to do analysis work that can help you start building, especially if you're in that small business or that startup. But you can't just say, oh, I need somebody who's heads down, hands on keyboard for the whole time, because you as one person as a data leader aren't going to be able to talk to everybody in the business or get a full understanding of every single department the same way that two people might be able to tackle that problem. Whereas you as the data leader help prioritize the work, maybe do some of that analysis work and connect to the business. And the data engineer is doing more of that, like, behind the scenes plumbing work, but at the same time can speak to or can talk to the business. If you're a larger organization and you're starting to build out a data team, then if you have a software engineering team already who's built a lot of these source to target connections, and now you need somebody to come in there and help integrate or architect it, maybe you do bring in somebody who's more data architecture focused with a little bit of data engineering so that they can help basically get the house in order, and then take that work that software engineering has done in the past. If you have great business analysts or a great product office and you don't really have any of that source to target, but you have a great connection between some of the data that are kind of floating around to what the business needs, and business requirement gathering goes really well, then you do need someone who's more technical, and you could probably have someone who's more heads down, hands on keyboard, rather than having somebody who's a tweener between engineering and being an analyst. So it depends on the business in terms of how you want to construct the team or the type of role that you're trying to think of. I think ultimately, regardless of size of company, team you're trying to build, the best people I've worked with are people who are not egotistical or want to be subject matter experts about one specific thing and that's it. So having people who can adapt to new environments, who are willing to learn, who don't find any work beneath them, and are willing to grow regardless of where they're at in their career. Those are the best people that I've managed and that I've worked with. But yeah, in terms of who you're hiring or how you're building the team out, it really is dependent on terms of the maturity of the org, maturity of the data team, and the type of roles and teams around you.
Yeah. In terms of like, let's say you were focusing on a larger company, maybe, a larger enterprise, somewhere over, 5 or 10,000 employees. Have you ever, or do you see certain setups of data teams more effective? Like a lot of people like to think of like the centralized, decentralized, maybe some of the hybrid approaches as being helpful. Have you seen any that kind of stick out in any specific context?
So my ideal state would be having a central hub or a central team with federated branches of data that go into each of the business units or different subject areas. Because for me, if you go too centralized, you lose a lot of connectivity to direct business activity in terms of what the business needs or what these different business lines are doing. It's, I think, too standardized to really fit all of the different use cases that you might have as a large enterprise or large organization. If you go too federated, you basically have a bunch of people doing whatever they want in terms of like shadow IT or shadow data, and it gets too disjointed from one another. And then you start to have that's where I see a lot of risk from like one person has Tableau, or one team has Tableau, one team has Power BI, one team has AWS, one team has GCP, one team is using Atlin, the other team is using Purview. Like you have all of these different vendor costs and vendor spends by all of these different groups. And then when you try to roll all of that into one or try to standardize that across the organization because you're going to save $5 million in spend year over year, then you irk one team or multiple teams, and also just the lift in terms of the translation across each of those different technologies, sometimes a 2 to 3 year roadmap. And so that's the risk I see from like being too federated. But when you when you have a central team that sets the standard and takes in all of the information and pushes it out into each of the different business units, but then you still have a data team that is connected to both the center as well as to each of the individual business units, you maintain some of that connectivity or that focus on each of the business units while still not losing that standardization or that like the mature data practice that you have from a central place. So that's my ideal state. It is more costly, obviously, because you're gonna have more resources, and maybe the like intermediate step there, if you're a company that's a little bit smaller and you don't have enough to get a data engineer and a product owner and a data analyst that are dedicated to a specific business area, is maybe you have like a group that's dedicated to 2 or 3 of your different business units. So you still have like 1 degree of separation from centralized, but you're not necessarily taking on one for each until your business has grown enough or you have enough revenue to afford all of those different resources.
Yeah. And with standards, that was something I really, really enjoyed at Facebook or especially after working at large enterprises, was instead of every team you go to, there's a different solution. Like you said, one team's using Informatica, one team's using Airflow, one team's using Talon, one team's using whatever. It's like, look, you guys can kind of do what you want in terms of like the projects you take on, how you kind of implement even like maybe your data warehouse and different components. But the tools we're all going to use is going to be the same, because that just it really does simplify the whole process, both between, hey, you want to switch teams, that's easy because it's not a different technology. You don't have to like spend time getting up to speed. Everyone's using the same tech stack. But then also, again, like you said, with cost, it's like cost is easy. You don't have to deal with like, oh, we've got 5 different migrations going on because we have different tools that are migrating for different reasons. It's like we have one migration. It's all going to happen at the same time. It's all going to go the same way. And so there's just so many benefits, I think, to having and trying to have a single solution. Usually the pain point that I think some companies run into there is like maybe at some point they had a centralized set of data tools, and then they bought 10 companies, and now you've got 30 data tools because, obviously those other 10 companies were doing their own thing, and yeah, you want to get them on board, but it's going to take 5 years to get everyone to shift over. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think those problems of the technology getting out of hand in terms of like a central team that starts to federate too much, or like you said, acquisition of many companies. I think that should be part of the acquisition decision, is like, if ultimately a lot of companies do acquisitions as well for like the customer data that they're acquiring, or the ability to roll all of their operations into their enterprise and start to achieve some cost savings. Like technology, vendor spend, customer data, all of those are part of the same problem as like trying to centralize HR, or trying to centralize other operations that are handled at each of those different businesses in-house. So like, if you're not taking that into consideration during the due diligence process of the merger, the acquisition that you're doing, I think that's like a failure point on whoever's conducting the due diligence. And I also think that if you don't have strong data leadership or strong tech leadership in place to raise those alarms, or explain how that process is going to take a year, 2 years, 3 years, or we could do it now, but we need to spend $1 million in consultant spend in order to get this migration to happen so that we're good to go by 2025 or 2026. Like, if you don't have somebody doing that during the due diligence process, that is ultimately going to come back to bite you.
Yeah, which again goes back to like making sure you have a seat at the table, or if you're a CEO, making sure your tech people have a seat at the table when you decide you want to merge, because, like I said, it can get very expensive. Something that seems, it's like, oh, okay, they're whatever on-prem, we're in the cloud, they're on Oracle, we're on Microsoft. It'll be fine. It'll take no time. I assume most CEOs know now that would be hard, but again, I don't know. Have you had any conversations like that with any of your projects?
I mean, I think generally the whole notion that this quote unquote quick fix is going to be quick is something that plagues a lot of organizations, from something as simple as a dashboard fix to something as complicated as a data migration. And so, yeah, I mean, I've definitely experienced that many times in my career, where people think that something's going to be just very quick to implement, or this migration is going to happen in 6 months or a year. And then I'll speak to that company or people in that company a couple of years later for several of the consulting engagements that I was on. And I'll hear 3 years later that they're still dealing with that migration that we were talking about in 2019 or 2020. And I think that just, what I've experienced, and I don't know if you have as well, is like, the more, and obviously you have to remove like the FANG companies from this, but the larger the organization, and in my opinion, the more difficult it is to change or innovate within data, and the longer cycle times to deploy anything or to migrate anything. Because if you're like a small boutique company that is only focused on like marketing or makeup brand or something, to say you need to move your data from on-prem to the cloud is like, all right, 1-2 levels of approval, you get that cut over, you get it stood up. If you're a large Fortune 100 company and you say, I need you to migrate from on-prem to the cloud, or I need you to migrate from AWS to Azure, like, it's 6 months of planning, another 6 months of getting the project stood up in the EPMO, another 6 months of procurement, approving everything, by which point half the team is working on other things or is not available anymore. And then you start the process and you start to migrate, and then you realize all the pain points that come with it. And then a year later, you're like, well, what if we migrate to this other platform instead? And then you kick all of that off again. So
Yeah.
I've just experienced too, a lot of the times, these larger companies with a lot of process and red tape that is necessary to run a global or national business can end up delaying development time significantly, and hurt in terms of like what they've lost out on from a completeness of data, quality of data, or the opportunity cost of what they could do with that data.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's generally, I think, pretty standard. Like I've done migrations for small companies, and you're talking about windows of months, and like you said, there's like very little approval. But then on the flip side, I've worked with large organizations, and you already know, like you're like it's gonna take, again, just months just to even plan this, because the impact of you doing it wrong is not like, oh, our users are going to be shut out for 30 minutes. In some cases, it's like we're going to lose millions of dollars if one part of this isn't done correctly. If one part of, if that one workflow doesn't work anymore, that's like connected to something with like ad spend, or connected to something like direct mailers that already drives a good amount of your business, and now it doesn't operate, or it doesn't work. I mean, again, it's not a small cost. It's something that can be astronomical for some companies. I remember like there's entire articles that are connected to like usually ERPs, but like ERP failures in terms of like trying to migrate, because it can just be so bad in terms of like cost, and something that seems simple. Like I don't remember what the company was, but they were all on like SAP, and it was like the same version of SAP, and they just couldn't migrate. Like it just was like, nope, it's all the same system, but even that is very hard to get everyone on the same page.
Or like in those migrations, if it's an ERP or if it's whatever technology, what are the downstream impacts on you migrating? How many different processes have a bunch of custom business logic that are dependent on a column name or a format type of the underlying data, that now when you migrate to this new solution or this new tool, it's nvarchar instead of varchar, and that is going to throw off everything? Or it's expecting to have 500 characters and you're only going to put 499 in the new solution, and that's going to throw off everything. Like that's another aspect that people don't think about too, is like all of the underlying tech debt that has been woven beneath the surface that you have to unravel and streamline before doing that migration. And then the other part too is, what about what we were talking about earlier, the change management aspect and the people aspect? Like if you are just changing out the back end and they don't notice the front end shift or change, fine, it's not going to really be that impactful for people. But what about if you're a health system that's acquired 4 other health systems, and all of those 4 new health systems are all on different EMRs, and now you have to convert everybody to a new EMR platform? So now all of those doctors and all of those nurses and all of the staff that have been working in that EMR system, like Allscripts or Epic or Cerner or whatever, are now all having to migrate to Meditech or something like that. Now you have to educate and teach all those people what the nuances and the differences between their old system and the new system. And to your point, you have to do that without impacting operations, without losing a bunch of money from people not being locked out of the system or not knowing how to use the system. And that's not even considering the different transformations that you have to do in terms of mapping from one system to another, transformations that need to occur. Maybe that business that you acquired have different SLA agreements than what you have internally. So you have to delete a bunch of records based off of whatever your new SLA is. So it's not only the migration, but it's the people aspect. And it's just, there's a lot of factors that come into play with each of those components.
Any tips?
Just don't do it. Don't do data.
Just don't do data, don't do technology. We're all going back to pen and paper.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think if you're an acquiring company, that just needs to be part of your due diligence process is the biggest tip that I can give. And that's the tip from the first thing that we were talking about to now, is like communicating, understanding the problem before you get started, understanding whatever the end goal is, and then mapping from there, and not just making a rash decision or a decision that's incomplete.
Yeah, no, I like that. We have at least one question that I would, just to clarify something, so I'm just gonna put up. So we talked about central teams, and I think the question being here is like, do we mean having everyone being part of the same org, so data engineers, analysts, etc., or how do you view central teams?
You want to take that one first? I'm happy to, but
Sure. I mean, I think I think it can mean a few different things. Is the way I view it, right? Because a central team could be a central data team, but I also see some companies that view it as like we have a central analytics team, we have a central data engineering team, we have a central platform and dev team, which you know come with different problems, but they're all kind of centralized. They still have the issue of not being plugged into the business, which is usually where some of the issues can come in, unless you're a smaller organization and it doesn't make sense to have the overhead of trying to manage 10 different teams, and instead you want to manage one. But yeah, that's I can view it in both ways, where sometimes it's just a very linear single team, in other cases where it's a little more broken out in their specific niches.
Yeah, I think that the central team to me, or the definition of the same org here, as I think Terrell is how you pronounce his name, is asking, is the buck needs to stop with somebody. There needs to be a data leader where that's the person that is making those decisions. Oftentimes I see you have a head of engineering or a head of analytics, and then there's no data leader on top of them, and you maybe have engineering that's reporting to the CTO and analytics is reporting to the COO. So where from program level do you go from there? How do you ensure that people are working across each team? Maybe the COO is, even though they're both C-level, slightly higher than the CTO because the CTO reports to the CIO, and the CIO and the COO are really peers, or the COO also is a board member and it just holds more weight in terms of the decision-making process. So analytics gets more credence, gets more funding. Like that to me is a big problem. And what I feel from a central team needs to happen is you need to ensure that all parts of data are rolled up into the same org and the same department with an individual leader. And from there, maybe there is a head of engineering and a head of analytics and a head of data governance and a head of data science. And all of those people are peers and they roll up into the chief data officer, or the chief analytics officer, whatever the alphabet soup is of that head role. But at least there, from a program level, you do have consistency and standardization in terms of what the team is working on, rather than maybe one data team versus another data team feeling that their work is more valuable or they're more emboldened. And so there is no like cross-functional collaboration between those teams. It's segmented, it's siloed. Then analytics starts doing some data engineering work that they shouldn't be doing. Engineering starts doing some analytics work that they shouldn't be doing. And then there's duplicative efforts, finger pointing, and just a lack of progress.
Yeah. No, I like that. Well, I want to be mindful of time. It is 10:30. Eric, thank you so much for everything you've already provided in terms of answers. And just want to know, is there any questions you have? Anything else you'd like to say?
Well, if anybody wants to connect with me, LinkedIn, EG Data Guy. So feel free to shoot me a message or shoot me a request. I think just asking you one final question, like,
Sure.
what is your ultimate tool to getting business buy-in to keep it in theme with what we're talking about here?
Ultimate tool. I mean, I think I imagine this is more of a like high level philosophical tool. So something along the lines of either communication or collaboration, where you're trying to make sure one, the business knows what's coming, but then also two, you're I'm trying to think here. What I'm trying to say this. You want to make sure, or at least in my world, in my view, that like whatever you're going to be deploying and how you're going to be communicating it is something that like helps whoever your stakeholders are, in the sense of like ROI, but also in just making their lives better. So I think that's another thing where it's like helping them understand that what we're doing makes your life better. Because I think that's the end goal, is whatever it is, whether it's saving you hours on reporting, whether it's helping you make a better decision and then that gets you your promotion or something. Helping them have that ability is kind of the thing I want to paint or give them. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I think a lot of people get threatened by data or any sort of automation or new technology that comes into their world, that this is going to be a replacement to them,
Yeah.
and that their role or their function is no longer going to exist because of this. And something I often find myself doing is like showing how it's going to get their head above water, or that they won't have to do these rote monotonous tasks anymore, and they can start to focus on more high level strategic items. Or there's now not a one-to-one cost increase in terms of acquiring a new client and hiring new tech resources or new data resources in order to replicate the same process. So yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you for the question. Awesome. Well, again, thank you. And thank you everyone watching. Any final thoughts before hitting stream?
All good. Thank you all.
Awesome. Hitting end stream.